This really couldn't be nicer. It really, really couldn't be nicer. I'm tempted to shorten this by half an hour so we can just sit in the sunshine and talk. But you're going to get 45 minutes on the connection between making and writing and archives. And it's called In Praise of Shadows, which is a phrase which comes from a beautiful book by the Japanese novelist Tanizaki, where he talks about why shadows matter, about a culture which is built around the perception and understanding of not everything being brightly lit. So really, that's what I'm going to talk about, bringing things into the light, but leaving some things in the shadows. And this is obviously a place which is completely to do with shadow and light. So that's going to be the tempo of my talk. And I'm not going to anecdotalize about your director's early years, 25 years ago, at Kettle's Yard at all. I'm beginning with a book which I wrote and which has mucked my life up completely. It's a book about netsuke, about small little Japanese objects for the hand, objects for touch. And 2 years ago next week, I had a book launch in the vaults of Somerset House, which is an ossuary. It's where you bury dead people. And all my writer friends said to me very happily, well, that's not a very good place to launch a book. It will never come into the light at all. And unexpectedly, 2 years on, it has a life, which is lovely and glorious, but it's also very, very complicating. Because what it brings with it is serious engagement with readers, with people who want to talk to me, with people who are in conversation with some of the things that I talk about in my family memoir. They want to write to me about exile or loss. They want to write to me about what it is to try and understand where your family came from. They want to talk to me about objects, what objects mean. There are lots and lots and lots of letters every day. And we have a principle in the studio that if you are 90, you get a response that day. And if you're 80s, you'll be responded to within a week. And if in your 70s, you may have to wait a little longer. And beyond that, I'm afraid you can whistle. But one of the key things about publishing this book 2 years ago was people said, with some distress, why can't we see these objects you're talking about? Now, I thought that my book was a book of shadows, that objects within it were described but not shown. But there was such a pull to actually do a different kind of book which showed the objects that I agreed on the proviso that we designed it ourselves, that we actually had a chance to do the book which showed the right kinds of objects in the right kind of way. And so a few months ago, we published this book, which had these objects within it, the netsuke within it, shown as they are within a vitrine, within a glass case. But also, I made the call that I wanted to bring alive some of the archival material I'd found, some of the things I cared about in researching this journey, but show them within the book in a real way. I wanted them to exist within the book in the way that I had discovered them, which sounds completely pretentious, but tough. So what I did was to use some of the images. This is my grandmother, Elizabeth, in their carriage on their Orient Express. This is Charles's bed, Charles Efrusi's bed, which he bought off a Medici princeling, and he unstitched the M for Medici and put E for Efrusi. being a good bling member of my family. But what I wanted to do was to use that sense of the tactility of texts, the sense of discovering things in archives, photographs, sales catalogues, incredibly poignant. This is my great-great-uncle buying this amazing clock and what he bid for it. And I find this in the Louvre, this book, this sales catalogue. But finding these things, and this is now in the Getty, where I made I thought, hilarious joke when I went to America for my book tour of standing in the Getty with all these ranks of trustees in front of me and showing this image and saying, "I've come to take it home," which they didn't find very funny. But wonderful things I'd found out because of the book. This is Charles's mistress, Louise, a great portrait of her. And wonderful pictures as well of Charles's collection, these incredible Impressionist paintings, which of course I don't have at home. They are elsewhere. Some of them you will know very well indeed. But I wanted to bring out the poignancy of the journey through texts. I wanted to bring that sense of what it is to spend that time with documents, in galleries, thinking about and trying to trace a story. And it's a very, very exciting and it's a very complicated journey to undertake. You find terrible things along the way. This is Edmund de Waal, who was the great anti-Semite. And this was a book that I found in the London Library with terrible marginalia, anti-Semitic marginalia about my family. But that's important. That was part of the journey. But then there were also extraordinary things that emerged out of nowhere. This is a terrible painting, but it's a painting of one of my cousins in Paris in 1900, showing a great vitrine in the corner of his apartment on the Avenue Foch. And then this appeared, this beautiful portrait of Charles, who collected the Netscape, and it came up at auction only last autumn from a house sale in Paris. This beautiful, beautiful, poignant cabinet portrait, as big as let's find a Ben Nicholson to look at, as big as one of those. And I bid desperately for it, and it's gone off to Japan. But extraordinary things, this texture of archives, this feeling of what it is to be on the journey. So these are the things that emerged, and these are the kinds of things that I interspersed into this new edition. All kinds of things, including this extraordinary portrait of my father, painted when he was Dean of Canterbury, but painted as a rabbi by my wonderful great aunt. But how do you do this? How do you bring things into that kind of textual life? So the books that I used, which I thought worked best, were this wonderful book that came out recently on Walter Benjamin's archive, where the images were so exact, where every single book was given a space and given a sense of the weight of the text. And this is something I'll come back to. So these extraordinary and powerful images. And then the other great polar example, all the way across from exactitude, was the novels of W.G. Sebald. These wonderful, powerful books about, everyone's nodding, what a nice audience to be in. I can relax with Sebald, where of course things are out of focus. These are the kinds of photographs that you might find on your seat next to you on a train going across Europe. These sort of things that you find by happenstance and are all the more powerful for their sense of existing in this marginal, vulnerable way. So that's what we did. We made a book where these extraordinarily powerful archival things exist in some kind of form within a book. Now, the reason that matters to me was that as soon as this book came out and had a life, I realized that ahead of me was going to be a very complicated and difficult occasion, and I wanted to make sure that this text had its own life. The difficult occasion was this. It was the reality of the German publication, the publication in Austria of this book. I knew that this was ahead of me, and of course, how could I not be anxious about what that would mean? And so I said that I would come and launch the book in Austria, in Vienna, but on one condition. And the condition was that I could launch it in the old house on the Ringstrasse, the Palais of Frussy, the house which my father had grown up in and had been requisitioned and looted systematically by the Nazis. And so in October last year, I went back and talked in the Palais with about 450 people there. And I talked about what it was to be on this journey. And the reason I could do that was I kept thinking about this extraordinary bringing back together of a story and a place and a text. A story, a place, and a text into one place. And I thought of it as restitution, not the giving back of pictures and of art, not that kind of rather blunt instrument, necessary but blunt instrument of taking back, being given back what has been taken off you, but actually the restitution of a story and of a family to a place. And that's what I talked about with 450 people from Vienna around me in this family house. And bloody difficult it was too, I can tell you. But it was possible because I was doing it with my father and my family there. The first time that the family had been back since 1938. Now, the reason this matters to me because it's my father, it matters to me because it's my children. But what it really is about the importance of archives and research and journeying. It's the importance of bringing things out of the darkness, but admitting to the darkness. The point about this is that my sense of this extraordinary palace on the Ringstrasse, glazed, I think I say somewhere in the book, glazed like a vitrine, this whole house is like a vitrine, was that this was a place where many, many, many things had gone on which had been ignored and rejected and left alone from 1938 onwards, and that the book was a journey into those shadows. It was a book which was, in some senses, facing up to what can happen when you deal with archives. Because archives matter. Archives matter a lot. In fact, in my lovely pile of letters, I have love letters from archivists saying, "You care about archives." And this matters profoundly to me because I've written a book, but of course what I actually am is an artist. I make things and I try and find a way of bringing them into the world and keeping them within the world in a particular kind of way. And the way I think about objects and the way I make them and display them is profoundly influenced by my reading, my writing, my traveling, my thinking, and my time in archives. It's also completely affected by the experience of how words work on pages. And the way that you read with your hands, as well as your eyes, as well as with your ears. I think I'm on some bizarre spectrum but when I read, and these are wonderful lists lists from Walter Benjamin's archive. But when I do read or hear language, I feel a physicality there. I actually understand words visually and somatically, bodily. I know it's weird, but it's true. In fact, that blooming book I wrote, I think of as a made object. It's actually a thing for me. It's a series of walks, it's a series of phrases, it's a series of repetitions. And actually, the whole book is a series of physical phrases that are brought together. So that's tough, but that's the way I think about it. But my experience of working with archives and thinking about how language works, of course, makes me feel, this is a wonderful list. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about what I'm showing you. This is a wonderful list of the categories of objects in the Fitzwilliam. Declarations 6, documents 1, drafts 25, illuminated manuscripts 240, etc. And there is a wonderful phrase somewhere, bear with me, where it goes, vessel 5090, vessel perhaps 1. Bless you, Fitzwilliam. But these experiences of thinking about text, thinking about words, thinking about how they work in the world, of course, completely informs the way I think about objects and the way I make objects. And 2 years ago, I stood in my exhibition at Alan Christier's gallery called From Zero. I'd finished my book. My book was being printed, and I'm so slow, but I stood for the first time silently in the gallery. No one was there, and I realized I'd made a vitrine for the first time in my life. The first time ever I'd actually made something and put it behind glass. All my life before that, I'd put things on shelves, but I'd never put anything in a vitrine. I spent 5 long years writing about vitrines, tracing them, trying to understand what happens when you still a bit of the world, when you put something behind glass and you isolate it and you take a bit of the air around it and you just pause an object, which is what a vitrine does. You pause an object in space, like you can pause a word on a page. And it took me all that time, but there I was suddenly in the show at Alan's gallery, realizing very belatedly that I'd made my first vitrine. Word for word. I looked at it, it's a text, and then it's words around it, and then it's footnotes. It's all that, but it's just pots on shelves in a glass case as well. I had a very, very severe telling off from a Talmudic scholar who said, it's obviously from the Talmud, but actually this bit should be there. But I stood there and realized it wasn't finished. It was there, but it wasn't finished. And that it needed something else. It was word for word. So I made it again. And this time, behind opaque glass, for the very first time in my life. And so they sit next to each other, and they are the same. But one is a palimpsest, one is a writing over. It's a reworking, it's a reiteration. And of course, it's a book as well. It's the opening up of a book and finding those words and having that cadence between objects. And this, for goodness sake, is a place which is full of the cadence of objects. Lucky old you can see up there the white plates in that wonderful lyrical line up there, which have mattered to me, I have to say, over the last 25 years. And so, the book is out in the world. And I discover I'm allowed to make vitrines. So have I had fun? I made a series of pieces which were completely autobiographical, where I went back into making the objects that I've made over the almost 40 years I've made pots, and made a series of works which are completely autobiographical. This is a piece called Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, where I've actually taken forms that I hadn't made since my apprenticeship or hadn't made since I was in Japan, and made them again, but kept them in that kind of, I don't think of things in stasis in vitrines, I think of them as sort of just slightly paused. And I made other works where there are these iterations across a gap, where there is a conversation between the objects going one way and then another. And even more dramatically, a piece called The Origins of Silent Reading, where I try and understand how the pauses in talking, the pauses in reading. This is an incredibly learned piece, and obviously a Cambridge audience, but you'll be pleased to hear you don't have time for my lecture on the origins of silent reading. But a lot of this comes out of really finding that I can express the things I want to express. This is Ourselves Behind Ourselves, which is a wonderful lyrical bit of Emily Dickinson that I can use and think and be in conversation with all kinds of things I care about. It's pots, it's vessels, but actually, do you know what? I'm allowed to do it. And some of them are, I have to say, quite odd. I've been using these opaque vitrines and loved them. A rather fierce county woman came up to me at an exhibition and said, having seen a piece, not this piece, another piece, and said, "My dear, it's like a failed eye test." But I love it. Because that blurring, that sense of things which are just out of reach, is, of course, in praise of darkness, in praise of shadows. It's that sense of things being more exact in your memory than they are when you see them. That extraordinary thing where you can walk round an exhibition and in memory things have an intensity which is even greater than your presence when you're standing in front of them. And so quite a lot of my new work is about things that are actually fugitive, in flight, not obvious. They can be very, very high up, for instance. This is a piece called A Lament, which has just been... Am I allowed to talk about this? Yes. It's just been installed last week at the Royal Academy for the show. I didn't know whether I was allowed to talk about it. Okay. There you go. This is your private view. And it's a lament. So it's high, high, high up. Thank God I didn't have to go up on this dreadful thing. And it's just that extraordinary feeling of, you know, a lament is letting go. A lament is letting go of an emotion. It's an extraordinary voicing of something which is very powerful. And so it's that sort of breath of smoke and air and voice and words being let go of. So this is very high up. And you can't really see what's there, which is what a lament does. And so I'm making things, and I'm working towards an exhibition in which this piece is going to be shown in praise of shadows. But I'm also continuing to work with archives. And a year ago, almost 2 years ago, I had an invitation from Waddesdon Manor, which is the extraordinary over-the-top, Belle Epoque calling card that the Rothschilds left in the Buckinghamshire countryside in the 1870s. It's an enormous palace of gilt, G-I-L-T. It's full of Sèvres, it's full of Meissen, it's full of extraordinary Rococo furniture. It's completely over the top. And the invitation from Waddesdon was to do two things. It was to make a response, an intervention within the house, which I have to say is extraordinarily difficult. As the senior director there said to me, how on earth can you bring anything in to Waddesdon? Every single surface is completely covered with objects. But the other was to work with the archive, because there is this strange family connection between my Jewish family that I'd spent all those years working on and the Rothschild family. And they'd just built this extraordinary archive, this amazing archive to house all the Rothschild papers by Stephen Marshall, who's a fantastic architect. And he'd built this very light and airy archive building. And so, and this is part of the archive. And so I wanted to make work for both places, for an archive, to make work for an archive about what it's like to be in an archive, and to make work for this completely over the top. We're going to get to West Road. Everyone up there is looking really anxious because they commissioned this piece and they can't work out why I'm not talking about it. I promise you, we're getting towards the Sidgwick site. But I will hurry up. So I made this work for the archive. This is a piece called Thinking of X, I Remember Why. Because my experience of working in archives, ignore the Anish Kapoor, this is what you're looking at here. Because my experience of archives and my experience of research is that what's incredibly generative is getting lost. Is that incredible feeling of starting to think that you're going to work on something and then losing track. And if you go with that losing track, you end up in some extraordinary place, which can be quite amazing. And it can be awful as well, but it can often be very, very amazing. And my whole book is a love affair with the fact that if you are obsessional enough, you'll get somewhere stranger than where you started. So that's one piece I made. And the other piece, which really matters to me, was this vitrine here, which is called Unpacking My Library, which is, I don't know if you know it, but it's a beautiful, beautiful short essay by Walter Benjamin about the experience of opening a crate of boxes, a crate of books that he hasn't seen for 5 years. And he's opening them up in his library. And as he unpacks every single book, he remembers where he bought it, who he inherited it from. He remembers the underbidder at the auction in Geneva in 1920. He remembers the marginalia. It's that extraordinary sense of books as objects, of the physicality of reading and memory. And this is my love affair. It's a whole series of objects, including some gilded objects, which are perfect for an archive, for that love affair with archives. Because everything carries a trace with it of where it's come from. Sometimes it can be as poetic as this. This is the base of a Meissen pot in Waddesdon, and it's got all the different ownership marks from the different people it traces, just on that series of labels, its passage over the last 200 years. And in honor of that, for this particular exhibition in the studio, we made our own mark. So every single object in Waddesdon has its own new acquisition label. So wherever they go, they'll have that attached to them. But then Waddesdon itself, well, my first encounter with this place was not in its National Trust pomp at all. It was in winter. And in winter, the house is put to bed. It's incredibly melancholy. I've written an essay about this, and I said it's like a Visconti movie, and it really was. You came in, the shutters were down. This is boxes of porcelain, 18th century boxes with porcelain, everything shrouded. And so in response to that sense of how objects get put away, I decided that I would try and make work for several places within the house which actually had a feeling of poetry about them, had a feeling of a poetic response to why those objects were in this extraordinary house. So for that enormous fireplace with all these stacked boxes, I made this, which is, you can't actually see it, can you? Can you? Down here, it's a lead-lined box with 8 different lead-lined cabinets within it, each of them ready to be sort of packed up and sent on its way. And for this crazily grand, wonderful Reynolds picture and this mantelpiece, I made these very large vitrines, which I call a short walk in the 8th. It's a kind of flanneurial piece for a room. And then for this ridiculous desk, a desk I put somewhere which is the kind of desk you can write a treaty on. It's absolutely vast. There are shallow lacquer trays with black pots, which are sort of about writing and pools of ink, which are inserted into it. And then scattered around the house itself are a series of these pieces called a promise. They're hidden. And it's a diasporic work. I love that word. It's tough. You're going to have it. It's a diasporic work. It's scattered around the house. And you can find them or you can't find them. But they're single objects which are just held in that opaque quietness in different places. And then for the grandest place, the room where the man who collected all this extraordinary stuff, I made a pair of vitrines. This is where he was his Wunderkammer. It's where he had his most precious possessions. And I made a pair of vitrines. And then took work out of them so that there are pauses and gaps and losses within this place, because that's, of course, the history and the feeling of the place. It's a place which is full. It's fuller than almost anywhere you can imagine, but it also stands symbolically as a house which is the only house in Europe which has an intact collection of a Jewish family of that period. And then, damn it, because it's such a perfect environment, there's a lot of untidiness too. So for the dining room, on this vast and ridiculous Rococo side table, there's a stack of plates ready to be washed up, including one gilded one. And this is just, I think this is so beautiful. This is my vitrines. This is floating. It's on solid perspex. So that it really is not floating, actually. It's not actually floating, not that canny. But it holds itself discreetly within the space. Because, of course, that's what vitrines can do. Vitrines have a very, very odd life. They're in an environment, but they're architectural. They allow a different kind of space, a different kind of coherent architectural space to happen. If they're in dialogue with architecture, it's even more apparent than in an extraordinary and excessive interior like this. So, commissioners up there, there was the opportunity to work with Cambridge, to work with, in my first ever architectural commission. And I can't tell you how much this means. This is on the Sidgwick site. which is a place, of course, that I know. I read English here, and this is a place that I could sort of walk through blindfold. But this is a new building, and it's a building, the Alison Richards building, which opened with a great fanfare 2 weeks ago, which houses different faculty. Well, who's there? Crash is there. Yeah. South Asian Development Studies, Crash, Latin American Studies. It's an extraordinary conversation between different groups of people. And so I was thinking about this. I was thinking this isn't the history faculty. This is different groups of academics who are going to be sharing space. And I was trying to think, what is the common language between these different disciplines? What's the kind of commonality? What will everyone understand? And I thought what I'd really like to make is to make a piece called A Local History. To make a piece that actually worked with this extraordinary building, very beautiful building, very delicate building, but actually was a conversation with the work that happened in the building. And so I thought I'd make a piece about research. And what I'm doing, and it's going on site in August, so it will be unveiled at the beginning of September, is making a series of vitrines which are underground. So you can walk on your way into this building and you will walk across sunken vitrines, 3 of them outside, in which there's porcelain. I think there's something like 400 pieces of porcelain in these 3 vitrines at different depths. Some of them will be close to the surface, so you can see everything in kind of crisp detail. And some of them will be in praise of shadows, where there are objects going down and down and down and down and down. And it's archaeology. And it's archives. And it's holding things and pausing them. You know they're there, you know they're significant, but you can't quite work it out, which of course is the beginning of research and the beginning of almost everything. So it's a series of vitrines going up to the threshold of this beautiful new building. And then, by the way, this is all tremendously exciting and new because, of course, how you can make a vitrine which people can walk across is fantastic, and how you can make it so people don't dig it up is even more exciting. But we won't go into that. And then I thought, as a sort of a punctum, as a place of rest, at the very end, I'd make something for the inside of the building too. So, actually, for outside, and then as you go up the stairs, there's going to be a large vitrine hanging on the walls for those people who are in the building. And if you nip around the back, have a cup of tea, you can see it as well. Is that right? Yes, it's right. So it's a local history. It doesn't look like this anymore. I'm sorry. This is before it was finished. And that's my story. That's why I'm here in this lovely place, which is to say that I've had this extraordinary opportunity to work on the biggest public commission I could dream of, and to work with architects, to work with Commissions East, to work with the academics in the building, and to work in a very real sense with what I think is the core of this place, which is the honouring of research. So this brings together books, it brings together objects, and it wraps them into a vitrine which stills things for a bit. So that's why I'm here. Thank you very much.